Hello and welcome to Pickup's On The Move podcast. Today we have David Torr on the show. Welcome, David.
Thanks, man. Yeah.
Great to have you here.
Appreciate being here.
Tell us a little bit more about UCook. When did it start? How did it all come to be?
Look, I mean, I think like my kind of my departure into kind of like early stage, I guess, venturing was pretty kind of unorthodox. I was 24, so slightly kind of old, and I was kind of like living in Thailand at the time, and I connected with a friend of mine that ultimately ended up becoming a co-founder. And at that point, there was this kind of, I guess, there was this interesting stuff that was happening globally in the kind of dinner kit space. Obviously you had kind of HelloFresh that was really making, crazy insurgence in Europe. And I think if you looked at the local market, there was this kind of confluence of different variables that we thought made for a potentially interesting dinner kit case. So you had like Yappy Chef, which was like this e-commerce anomaly selling bloody, avocado holders in a market that, where e-commerce was like kind of barely happening. You had people spending a crazy amount of money in what was, in essence, a kind of regressive, downturn, still buying free-range kind of potatoes from Woolworths. And then I think you still do have a very kind of aspirational consumer that is interested in cooking. Like cooking as an activity, I think, is something that the South African customer is kind of very interested in doing. I think Tin Noakes had just come out at that point, and that was like the big crave, Banting, whatever else. So look, it felt like an interesting idea. It wasn't a kind of overnight success. I mean, for the first year, we were trading out of a garage in Newlands, paying ourselves, nothing, sourcing a lot of the product from Pick n Pay. And then, I think we kind of managed to get it right and raise a bit of capital.
Cool. So before we get into the whole bootstrapping, which is clearly you guys went down that road, the idea, like the concept of solving a problem.
Sure.
Entrepreneurs are either like fixated on solving a problem, or they're sort of bringing in ideas from abroad and sort of thinking about how's this going to work in South Africa.
Sure.
It sounds like yours was like a combination of like what was working overseas, HelloFresh, and also like what can work here. How did those synergies work together in coming up with the idea and the brand that you guys developed?
I think that there's kind of like two. So often we, in Africa, have unsuccessfully managed to attempt to kind of insert models that have done well in, kind of more developed economies. We've tried to copy paste things, and often they don't work. So I think sometimes it's great to get an idea from kind of somewhere else, but then to contextualize and really try to understand exactly like what are the kind of problems that you're solving for people on the ground. Super important. I think in UCook's case, we did two things, right? I think one, we were probably the first online food concept that made eating kind of like ethically, like, I don't want to use the word turnkey because it's a terrible word. I'm trying not to swear, I might swear, guys, but it's a terrible word, but we made that like very accessible, right? If you wanted to kind of eat free-range product, you were only kind of interested in eating within a specific kind of like dietary, like, maybe it's Banting or maybe it's kind of like vegetarian. I think we made that very easy to do, and we made those meals exciting, right? So I think, so that was the one thing, is making kind of like diets accessible, and I think we were quite good at making meals that tasted good, even if they were kind of like restrictive. And then I think the other thing that we did was like actually create this idea of kind of like learning to cook on the fly. So it wasn't just like I think with HelloFresh, it was more kind of like cost benefit, like, okay, it's actually really cheap and affordable to cook these meals. It maybe is even more affordable than going and sourcing all that product if you factor in wastage from the grocery store. So they were almost like a pure kind of value play. It was more just like kind of meal in a box. Whereas I think we played on the nuance of like teaching you to cook. There was almost like this upskilling component that I think was kind of a critical lever that allowed us to kind of accelerate quite quickly into what was, South Africa's kind of like middle to upper class. And it was super effective, right? So we'd partner with chefs, we'd kind of build this menu around dishes that were in the restaurant, which allowed us to also be kind of quite targeted in terms of the communities that we were accessing, also leveraging kind of like validating ourselves through these kind of partnerships. So I think, it was this kind of like, culinary enrichment plus, like accessible diets that made the proposition, I guess, unique to the market that we were targeting. Otherwise, we were, dinner kit and used a lot of the same levers. Yeah.
So it sounds like the value proposition was, a lot of focus went into that. which is super important. The early stages of any startup. So, I think how did you maintain the brand? It's clear that there were a lot of competitors in the space coming as you guys started. How did you stay ahead of the competition and maintain that value proposition to your customers?
Look, I mean, I think they were and they weren't. Like, we were kind of way behind Daily Dish and Day to Day when we kicked off. But then I think like we quite quickly managed to kind of like outstrip them, and we were kind of, I would say, you know, within the first year post-capitalization, I think we were bigger than both of them. So it was very clear that, you know, whilst they were kind of trading within the same space, I don't really think they were going to be kind of competitive. So I think pure dinner kit, for the first little bit of time, we didn't really have any direct competition. Where we ended up, I would say, kind of like losing market share was to obviously some of the big retailers, specifically Woolworths. We're most certainly sharing a customer with them. Obviously, they did meal in a bag. You know, people were going to Woolworths anyways. It's not like we were a kind of direct replacement for groceries. People are still buying their breakfast, they're still buying their lunch, they're still buying, you know, their kind of like toiletries. So I think that was kind of like problematic and quite challenging for us. Look, I think that the dynamism of having a new menu every week was a kind of very, very specific weapon that we could own that I don't think that they could ever replicate.
Sure.
Maybe just because of like the bureaucracy and the kind of like the box checking exercise that needs to go into, you know, doing something like that kind of on the fly. I think it would be very hard for organization who, I mean, brilliant, love Woolworths, incredible brand. I think they've done an amazing job of building one of the most impressive, I would say, kind of, you know, retail grocery businesses globally, actually. I mean, really, really cool. So lots of respect for them. But I would say it was like, yeah, it was the cyclical ability to constantly kind of renew menus. It was our ability to be super tactical and very agile. You know, we could kind of like flip something up in 2 weeks. Every single week for us was a new opportunity to campaign, to build an interesting kind of like unique slant on, you know, what we were going to be delivering that week. Was it a partnership? Was it a free bottle of wine that we were pairing with? So I think we were pretty good at I'd say, partnerships, and I think we were super agile as an organization.
And so that to go back to that early stage of bootstrapping, it sounds like your team was very important and instrumental in coming up with these on-the-fly recipes,
Sure.
Maintaining the quality of the food, the options for gluten-free, and what have you. How important? Well, let's talk to the bootstrapping. What were the three most important things that you guys focused on in the early stages that set you on the path?
Sure. Look, I think the kind of school of frugality that's bred through, you know, I guess through kind of like not having resources available to do stuff is not always the case that kind of like early stage. So a lot of founders are, you know, maybe they built some kind of credentials post in some kind of other career environment. They were a management consultant or they worked for a big firm and they got like this kind of like aha moment and like people back then, right? They were kind of pre-validated, so they get money and we're a motley crew of like rejects, you know what I mean? Like I dropped out of university after 2 weeks. You know, I was expelled from kind of 5 schools. I had traveled for 5 years before that, kind of doing nothing, you know, teaching English and working in a bar in Thailand. I mean, so like we didn't exactly have like a great set of credentials. So like, I think the bootstrapping thing was like largely just the byproduct of us not being able to like access any money to do anything because people were like, we're not going to back these like idiots, you know? Like these guys are you know, make no real sense to kind of like, you know, put capital behind. So I think we bootstrapped out of necessity, and I think what that bred though was this kind of like interesting and very, very kind of acute focus on really, really being tight. So we were really tight all the way through. We built a kind of 200 million rand kind of top line with, I don't know, maybe 10 million rand investment. Probably, I would say, without being kind of obnoxious, I'd like to say that we were probably the most efficient e-commerce startup in SA ever, really. Because if you look at the kind of quantums, I mean, you know, 10 to 200, like crazy conversion, I think most startups have kind of made as much revenue as they've raised capital, you know,
Sure.
in the e-commerce space. So I don't think I really answered the question, but yeah, we were tight, and I think it was largely a byproduct of behaviors that were kind of ingrained in us through necessity.
So the three things: closeness of the team, just I would say, the whole being naive. You in the beginning, you're just tackling it. You're tackling an idea, and you're just going full steam at it. One more.
Yeah. Okay. So bootstrapping. Look, I mean, I just want to also just kind of maybe iterate on what was interesting about YouCook as a early stage business was the fact that no one else in that business had anything better to do, right? So the options and available to these guys were like, limited. So we were willing to do a whole lot of like, kind of crazy work for, one, almost no pay, but also like this when things started to actually, when there was like small amounts of traction, it was almost like this glimmer of the light at the end of the tunnel, right? Like the silver lining that you could see on the horizon. That for everyone in that team who, like I said, to a large extent wasn't, they were kind of write-offs or whatever. That was amazing. It was a hugely kind of energizing thing to be like, holy shit, this maybe actually kind of turns into something that's not like an operation in Newlands next to our mom's Chrysler. You know what I mean? Like, so I think that was a big driving force as well, right? It's like, is maybe sharing a dream, right? Like collectively actually kind of being a part of this thing where you can all see the potential in it, and that's energizing.
Yeah. I can speak to that. When Picup started working with YouCook in those early stages, the team dynamics between all the founders and people that joined the business was just exceptional. I think that's what was hugely exciting for us, also being a startup at the time, proving our model with the YouCook team, working together to help YouCook deliver boxes to customers and for Picup to do deliveries. So hugely exciting. I think it's testament to how YouCook has really grown. Those early stages still going back to the bootstrapping, I want to talk to you mentioned the efficiencies that you needed to achieve in order to look at your unit economics or your product to actually be somewhat profitable when you are moving one box, selling one box to 10. All of that is important because the more money you need in the beginning, the harder it is. How did you manage that? The early stage of investment, where did you get investment from? Did you fund it yourself? And how did you know when to did you go the VC route?
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, I would say like quasi VC. Like I wish, I think like, so we took cash from Silvertree, which was like small kind of capital injection, still close to the guys, but it wasn't like a traditional VC round. So we took 3 million rand. Which was huge for us at the time. We had taken like 120K. That was like, scraping together like scraps from our parents. That bought us like our second-hand, like our fridge, like 2 heat sealers. We were like completely illegitimate, right? I mean, like very kind of illegal operation. You can't like, portion meat next to a car. So, prior to that, up to about 50 boxes, we were literally in a garage. We try to be out, we try to maintain reasonable levels of kind of like health and safety, but for all intents and purposes, we were more than less than a bootstrap startup. We were a kind of recreational hobby that wasn't paying anyone money, and I guess Silvertree saw in us a kind of determination. And I think we were quite smart. I think the team's not dumb, right? So I think that the planning was actually quite on point. Like the actual strategic kind of understanding of like what might make sense in the market if we applied capital to analysis was kind of there. So we raised a little bit of cash from them. And then we rolled that for years. I mean, it took us like 3 years before we raised again. We had really, I mean, this is kind of like maybe a bit of a kind of secret to the success was definitely the networking capital. Like the fact that we had payables, we were growing constantly and only having to pay our suppliers kind of 60 days later. That was like, and look at Zalando, same thing, right? Like your kind of cash conversion cycle has such a kind of like huge impact on the rate at which you're able to kind of scale, but also how efficiently you're able to allocate capital, right? So we had this like perpetual networking kind of like capital wheel in place that really funded a lot of the growth. So I'd say that was like absolutely critical because we didn't raise frequently, and when we raised, we sold 50% of the business, which retrospectively was a bad idea, right? I mean, again, who am I to say coming off the back of a kind of bartending job in Thailand, I was going to take whatever cash was put on the table, quite frankly. So, I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. So, talk more to that. Silvertree obviously eventually acquired the whole of UCook.
Yeah.
That to go into thinking about exits. So,
sure.
I mean, when you started the business, you're obviously never thinking about exits. Right?
Yeah.
How significant is thinking about exiting a business? How significant is it for entrepreneurs to actually
plan for it?
Sure.
Look, I think it's the wrong idea to plan for an exit at the start. It's fine to know that ultimately you want to have, there's some kind of liquidity event that you're chasing, and you don't want to like build this like legacy business that like stands the test of time. Very few people I think want to do that these days, right? Because we're this like evolving, universe, and there's all these interests and there's all this opportunity, and we can do so many things. They've been stuck to one thing, is boring for most. So I would say you can have the intention to exit, but the way in which you behave needs to be such that you are building a business forever. Like, I think the behavior has to be long term. If you're trying to find like quick money or like fast kind of anything, I think that you're like doing the wrong stuff. Like, I think like fundamentally, like businesses that make sense are layered businesses. They're like constantly finding incremental ways to kind of like improve themselves. Sure. Like, I think the anomalies that we read about online of like that kind of overnight success and then suddenly there was like a million is, sure, it happens, but it's like 1 in a billion. You know what I mean? Like, I think that the kind of focus for founders, if they want to be successful and they want to exit at some point, it's like build something sustainable, right? Build something with a set of economics that are exceptional. Like, I think that we're in this climate now specifically that's regressive, right? People are like no longer interested in like bullshit narratives about like, I don't know, 10-year horizons whereby you're going to pull this magic lever and suddenly you're going to make all this cash. Like, are you profitable, and are the levers that you're going to be pulling, are they believable levers, So, look, I think, I think you should build as if you're going to stick around forever, but sure, I didn't have the idea then. I didn't even think we were going to be successful. I was like insecure, low self-worth, had a lot of things. Like, it was super surprising when we got like a year in and we were doing, 500 boxes a week. I was like, what the fuck, this is crazy.
Yeah, and that from that first investment, it must have, Silvertree being a very good VC in South Africa,
sure.
and great team to work with, obviously, it must have set the foundation for that potential exit at some point.
Yes.
So the working, you knew what you were working towards every
sure.
single day, making sure the business is profitable, because ultimately they're not going to acquire the
sure.
rest of the business if it's not doing well. So how, like, at what point the driving force behind exiting, did you see it as a light at the end of the tunnel?
Opportunistic. So like the COVID kind of bubble, if you will, because it was a bubble, was like the perfect storm, like the perfect economic storm. So you had like e-commerce that was just like, right, everything, all industries, but then you also had like bored people, like sitting in the house. I mean, you guys would have seen, like over COVID, like we were doing like stupid numbers. We were completely over capacity. We couldn't take on more orders. It was the most bizarre, crazy thing. Like, sorry guys, waiting list, maybe 2 weeks time. Like people were like front loading orders for the future. You know what I mean? Insane. So look, they were like, ooh, like, great time to buy. They owned 50% of the business at the time. And I was like, this is a terrible trade, to be honest. Like, we're getting like kind of almost, less than 1x rev. If I look back on it, it's the best thing we ever did, amazing. But it wasn't like planned. I wanted to do a bigger round and build a kind of subscription grocery platform with a retailer. I actually wanted to kind of go agnostic, build a tech layer, set it on top of Woolworths, look at all their transactional data, and then actually try to build. Like, I think grocery subscription is a super interesting concept, right? Like, you could forecast almost to the T, specifically now with all of the kind of like predictive analytics and like ML tools that are out there, exactly what a person's kind of spending habits looks like by the week. Imagine if all of that was automated. Like, why do you have to go to this store to buy toothpaste? It makes no fucking sense, So we wanted to do something different, and I think we had the ability to kind of like fulfill fast, and we're actually in conversations with Naspers at the time, And then kind of Silvertree, you know, to be honest, what happened in the end was like, it was kind of like a little bit, there was a little bit of conflict, right? In that, like, we wanted to do other stuff. They wanted to maintain kind of like control premium. Yeah. And then the exit was the best option for all of us.
Yeah.
You know?
Sounds also like at that point, being very entrepreneurial, your imagination was going, ideas were, you know, looking to implement new ideas into the business. Investor comes in, wants to focus.
Yes.
Right? How, like, the balance of yourself as the entrepreneur driving the business, keeping the focus on the core product, because that, I think, for them was just numbers.
Yes.
Making sure the product is consistent, achieving your numbers. How did you manage that as
it's a good question, specifically for me. I think it's my biggest weakness and my greatest strength is that I have very, very low levels of, I struggle to like, I lose interest easily. Like my brain is very hyperactive. Like I'm like, obviously, you know, kind of close on, it's like ADHD, but like maybe it's another level. So I think Silvertree actually did a good job of keeping me focused and being like, okay, these are cool ideas. And then obviously you could kind of see that like post, you know, I ended up in a bunch of industries that are like pretty incongruent, you know, going semi-deep into some and now, you know, full-time on a new one. But no, it was tough. You know, I think the newness was largely the kind of constant pursuit of newness, the constant pursuit of kind of like ways to optimize, even if it was small, was like definitely a kind of big part of the business success. And that showed up in the way in which we marketed, that showed up in the way in which we kind of like were able to process and source and partner. But at the same time, had I not had like a kind of like set of parameters, I probably would have ended up trying to do too many things and then, you know, diluting my ability to do one or two things well, you know? So yeah, I think it was good. It was a good counterbalance. We had very, very kind of honest, and it was like the relationship was like very, you know, Pete ended up running the business with me for 2 years, you know? So it wasn't like an investor kind of operator relationship. We were like on the same page. Everything was a debate. And that was very good. It was very good to have that. I think focus is probably the most instrumental and material force. If you look at the composition of success in almost any industry, in almost any startup, in almost any business, right? Like focus is probably the one variable that's always there. Yeah. And it's hard. People are like, oh, focus, man, that's easy, just fucking, but it's not easy. It's actually super hard. Yeah. Anyways, or at least focus on what matters, you know? Yeah, one foot, anyways, yeah.
Moving on from UCook, that timing, you know, like you said, like COVID happened.
Yeah.
The full acquisition came, as COVID hit, volumes were through the roof.
Yeah.
Timing was good. How important is timing in any startup, in the journey of a startup?
Important. I think sequencing in just life, right, is super critical. Like, I mean, if you look at the venture space, look, I mean, I don't want to talk about like hype cycles and businesses that kind of like ride perfect timing, but I mean, that's like that's, you know, startup world 101, you know, AI, anything in AI now, right? Couldn't be a better time to get into AI. It doesn't matter what the AI does. If it's AIX, it's probably a good thing. So look, I think timing is huge. I think we were a interesting model at one point. We became like, you know, Denicate definitely fell off the bandwagon of like startups to watch because like when you get to a point whereby you realize that the kind of like there's the opposite of the J curve, right? You have like lots of customers and then you only have very few loyalists, and that's kind of like what consistency looks like over the course of the next bit. So yeah, I mean, look, ideally fundraise. If you're fundraising for a model, in an ideal world, the kind of externally people are excited about it. BNPL, Klarna, oh, you couldn't raise more money. Like you're doing a BNPL thing, you know, everyone was interested. Now, different universe, you know? So timing's been super instrumental. I don't think it's like, I think that you should always just be building from, you know, in an ideal world, from kind of some kind of internal anecdote or some kind of deep understanding or some kind of like deep yearning, right? There should always be a deeper reason fundamentally for why you're doing what you're doing. If you're like, oh shit, I could do it now because this is a good time to kind of be in X industry, you're probably doing the wrong stuff. Sure. And I think again, like at the end of the day, like, you know, like if you look at the kind of tides of time, it will eventually, the businesses that make sense with like numbers that make sense are the ones that kind of stick around and end up, you know, kind of exiting.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that the timing, especially of that COVID period for Picup and Cook was
amazing.
I remember when you're saying you couldn't order a box for 3 weeks, and you know, Picup could, in our concept, just get drivers there on a Monday and deliver them successfully. So timing for us as well through that COVID period was instrumental with our growth. Moving on from UCook, you exited. Was it long after you already started thinking about new ideas?
Yeah.
Was your mind moving?
Look, I'm going to be honest, like I think I was doing kind of like two jobs. Like we started this business Lelive with like Amanda DuPont, who's like a kind of like semi-relevant profile here, and a guy called Ian. Symmetry had got school and I really liked the numbers. The numbers were really good, like 80% GPs, like super sexy margins. I like consumer brands, I'd never done it before. So we started that, and I was actually like kind of, it was like 6 months before I left, but I just tell Symmetry, hey, do you guys want to invest? And like, you're like, it's a bit weird that you're taking us like this thing whilst you're still working. So I left that, and I did that quite intensely for a little bit of time. We've obviously now, you know, that business has kind of got its own little management team and it's kind of taking over. No, I didn't have enough of a break. I actually regret that. I think like, I finished UCook, I sold it was very anticlimactic. Like I'd made quite a bit of money, and it didn't really feel that good. It was weird, right? Like I like invested so much of my soul into this thing, and I was like, it's gonna be great. Like in this day, like I have this like vision, and I'm gonna like sit down and I'm gonna be like, wow, and I'm drinking wine and like having a cigarette and like looking into the distance, and I'm gonna like feel good about 7 years of like kind of hellish, you know, kind of like sacrifice, right? But it was actually very anticlimactic. I remember like, like walking away from the rest of the team being like, fuck, like, is this it? Because I'm not very materialistic. Like I don't really want for much. I've always been kind of like privileged, and I grew up in a nice, you know, very lucky with my kind of background. So it was weird, you know, it was weird. And then I went on a walk for like 8 weeks, you know, multi-day hike from Cedarburg through to Outeniqua and back. Like literally like 7-day replenishment, like hardcore Bear Grylls shit to try to like disconnect from my, and you know, and that wasn't hugely useful either.
Yeah.
So, you know.
So, and going into that sort of next phase, like, you know, again, going back to solving a problem.
Sure.
You know, if you're not constantly worried about something or trying to actually go in and solve something that you see as a problem, you're either looking at an idea or concept that can work either in South Africa or abroad. Like, speaking back to that combination, like was your mind constantly working, looking for new ideas?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for me, like, and this is maybe a, you know, part of the kind of like fundament of why I'm excited about what I'm doing now. I think I was trying to find purpose in my kind of day-to-day activities. So like for complete like scope, I think UCook was this incredible milestone and a kind of stepping stone for me, and allowed me to build like, you know, self-confidence. Like I learned so much, like got a, you know, kind of MBA through trial and error and success and failure. But it was, you know, it wasn't something that I could, you know, wake up. I wanted to feel like what I was doing kind of mattered. And I don't mean that necessarily in a kind of like socio-economic kind of sense, right? I just mean like, again, what's the deeper purpose? What's the reason that, what really, really makes you excited about kind of what you're doing? Yeah, and I guess I wanted to find a business that it felt like the problem that I was solving was one that was kind of meaningful, not just to, I don't know, kind of like aspiration, like affluent customers in SA, right? And then, so I was looking for that, right? I was looking for that with, trying to find that confluence of like businesses that scale, that make sense, because I'm capitalist at heart, unfortunately, truthfully. And yeah, I think tried a few things: cosmetics, payments, and now I'm in off-price fashion, which is super interesting.
So that is interesting. We were chatting about that earlier. Explain the concept.
Okay.
What is it about? Okay,
so globally, there's this massive kind of like overstock problem, and like it's positioned as a waste problem, but it's not, right? So like, you know, PVH, which is Calvin Klein, Tommy Hilfiger, say kind of like overproduces product. They can't sell all of it in a season. People return product a lot of the time that might smell like perfume, or there's a minor smudge, or it's slightly dusty, so it doesn't make it back onto the shelf. That's roughly around 17% of total fashion inventories produced a year. So if you like run the numbers, it's about $800 billion in global supply that doesn't like recirculate, right? So what happens to most of that stuff is it's kind of incinerated or it ends up in landfill. There are off-takers for product, but brands, it's not that like Louis Vuitton can't sell its like last season stuff. They don't want to, right? There's cannibalization concerns. So they don't want to sell product back into their own market, reducing, brand equity, decreasing the number of customers that are buying at full price. So what they end up doing is dark warehousing it, and then eventually it kind of gets destroyed. Obviously, that's a terrible kind of crippling environmental crisis. Probably the biggest polluter globally is fashion. I mean, there's a lot of hearsay around there. It's probably fashion. If you look at the ecological destruction, if you go to Ghana or Accra, you look at those kind of places, you look at how they've been dismantled through textile waste, it's insane, right? You have entire water systems that are like no longer usable because of all of the excess that ends up here as like secondhand clothing, 40% of which you can't even use, it is immediately discarded. So this was an interesting problem, and I think it's the opportunity to solve it locally by creating a kind of like non-erosive channel for brands to distribute their overstock and obsolete inventory through is exciting, because most of them don't have the ability to make material full price retail trade here, because obviously consumer climate doesn't allow for that. People don't have enough money to buy first-hand Tommy Hilfiger, first-hand Calvin Klein, at least not at scale. So the proposition is is building a platform. SA, we're focusing on kind of like retail and some social commerce stuff. Nigeria will probably be wholesale, as well as Kenya. If we can disrupt the second-hand clothing market, that for me would be like insane. In terms of like with the benefit, the output benefit there is like you're saving, tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of product that's otherwise just kind of discarded and is, causing huge environmental concerns. So there's an upside for us in that we're getting, product at 3 to 5% of retail, sometimes, 10% on the kind of upper end, but we're making fashion accessible for consumers in Africa. We're talking big brands, Ted Baker, Hugo Boss, CK, Bestseller, which is a kind of like a consortium of about 16 brands. We've been open for 10 days. We did months trade in the first 10 days, so super positive kind of economics. It's very clear that globally Africa is a kind of better destination to distribute kind of like obsolete product than Europe, because again, no cannibalization. So I think it's like the perfect storm. Also, like EU's just banned the destruction of clothing. They've got 2 years, so like now there's even more pressure to kind of make sure that product finds a home, which obviously for us means better trading terms and like, faster acquisition of kind of partnerships. So yeah, it feels good. It feels like there's a purpose as well that I can kind of get behind, which I think was missing in a lot of the things that I did previously. No,
that's great.
Yeah.
So it definitely sounds like you, in your mind, you're a problem solver. I think looking and understanding this problem of waste, clothing, textiles, finding a home for them is really important. So we can go on for hours.
Yeah.
David, I really enjoyed chatting to you today. Can I ask one thing? If you were sitting having a cup of tea or a beer with an entrepreneur and starting his business, what is the one thing you would tell him to focus on every single day in starting his business?
I think the truth about being a founder or a senior kind of like, co-founding kind of like counterpart in a business is that the excuse my phrase, the shittest parts of like the kind of like day-to-day operation will always filter to you, right? Like you're always going to have to solve the most hard, the most challenging, the most tricky, the most kind of cantankerous problems. If that's letting people go, or it's having to kind of like potentially tell everyone that holy shit, we don't have enough money to kind of keep paying everyone we're paying, or okay, we really need to get in these kind of product partnerships, otherwise we're just kind of not going to make targets. So it's you're solving for really tricky, tough things, and it's hard. It's really hard, right? And the chance of success is super small. Yeah. I mean, truthfully, it's probably like 4 or 5% of startups actually go the distance, make something of themselves, end up exiting. So like if there's like, real honest advice, it's like, how thick is your skin? You know what I mean? Like there's like tactical stuff and there's strategic stuff, and a lot of that stuff is kind of contextual and maybe only kind of applies like within the silo. The one thing that is 1000% constant is like building stuff, making stuff from nothing is super hard. And if you want to be successful at it and you want to build scale, like it's going to be really, 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 really tricky. And like you've got to kind of mentally condition yourself for that, because it's not easy. And I don't think enough people go into that early stage kind of, go into early stage stuff knowing that that's the truth, because it is.
Great. Well, if anyone gets the opportunity to sit down and chat to you, any startup founder, I think they're going to get some great advice. Thanks for being here today.
Cool, man.
And good luck with all your ventures.
Thank you.